There's a camera watching you right now. The words were barely louder than a breath, yet they cut cleanly through the quiet tension of the executive office like a thread pulled too tight. Alexander Grant's pen stopped half an inch above the contract. The polished silver tip hovered over the final signature line of a merger that analysts were already calling the largest tech acquisition of the year. Around him, the boardroom remained perfectly arranged. Dark walnut tables stretching nearly 20 feet, leather chairs aligned with careful precision, sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. No one spoke at first because no one seemed certain who had spoken. Then Alexander slowly turned his head toward the doorway. Standing just inside the open office door was a girl who clearly did not belong in a room like this. Naomi Carter held a small plastic bucket and a folded microfiber cloth, the kind used by the evening cleaning staff after the executives went home. Her gray maintenance badge hung loosely against the front of a faded navy hoodie that looked one size too big for her thin frame. She couldn't have been more than 17. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioning vent above the glass bookshelf behind Alexander's desk. The senior executives sitting along the table exchanged brief, confused glances. One of them leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath, though the words were too soft to make out. Naomi didn't move. She stood still with the cautious posture of someone who had learned long ago how easily a room full of powerful people could dismiss her presence. Alexander Grant studied her with a calm, analytical gaze. At 46, he had built Grant Dynamics from a two-person startup into a company worth more than $20 billion, and people often said he could read a situation in seconds. Right now he was doing exactly that. The girl's voice had not carried panic or hesitation. It had carried certainty. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced briefly at the wall behind him, then back at his face. "There's a camera watching you," she repeated, her tone steady but low enough that only the people closest to the head of the table could hear. Several executives immediately shifted in their chairs. One of them let out a short, awkward laugh as if assuming the girl had misunderstood something simple about the office security system. Another checked his watch impatiently. Naomi's eyes moved again toward the bookshelf behind Alexander's desk, where rows of carefully arranged business biographies reflected thin lines of sunlight. "It's not one of the building cameras," she added softly. "This one is hidden." Alexander slowly leaned back in his chair, the leather creasing beneath his shoulders. For a long second he said nothing. Naomi tightened her grip slightly around the handle of the cleaning bucket, but kept her expression calm. She had seen the reflection earlier that morning while wiping the glass cabinet outside the office hallway, a tiny flicker of red light tucked inside the narrow vent above the shelf. Most people would have ignored it. Most people would have assumed it was nothing. But Naomi Carter had grown up learning how to notice the things powerful people overlooked. The room remained suspended in silence. Outside the windows, traffic moved steadily along Lakeshore Drive, tiny cars glinting in the late afternoon sun. Inside the office, Alexander Grant slowly set the pen down on the table without signing the contract. Alexander Grant did not reach for the contract again. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes moving past Naomi toward the wall behind his desk, where the tall glass shelves reflected the afternoon light in narrow streaks across the dark wood floor. The office suddenly felt different, not louder, not chaotic, but charged with a quiet awareness that had not been there a moment earlier. The executives seated along the table were no longer looking at the contract. They were looking at the girl. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been, holding the small plastic bucket as if she had simply paused in the middle of her cleaning routine. Her shoulders were relaxed, but her eyes were alert, moving carefully across the room before settling again on Alexander. She had not expected anyone to believe her immediately. People rarely did. "You are saying someone placed a camera inside my office," Alexander said slowly, measuring each word. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." One of the board members near the end of the table let out a short breath of impatience. "Mr. Grant, with respect, the building already has a full security network. There are cameras in every hallway." Naomi shook her head gently. "Not that kind." The man frowned, but said nothing more. Alexander rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, studying the girl more carefully now. There was no performance in her posture, no nervous attempt to impress the room. only a calm certainty that made the executives shift uneasily in their seats. "How would you know something like that?" he asked. Naomi hesitated for a moment, then glanced toward the large window behind the conference table where the skyline of Chicago shimmered under late afternoon sunlight. "I clean the hallway outside your office every morning before school," she said. "Around 6:30. Several heads turned slightly. The timing made sense. The cleaning crew usually finished long before the executive staff arrived. "Today when I wiped the glass cabinet near your door, I saw a reflection in the vent above the bookshelf." Her eyes moved again toward the shelf behind Alexander. Just a small red dot. It blinked twice. Alexander followed her gaze slowly. The vent she mentioned sat about 8 feet above the floor, narrow and rectangular, painted the same muted gray as the surrounding wall, so it blended easily into the room. He had passed that spot every day for years without noticing anything unusual. Naomi shifted the bucket slightly in her hands, the plastic handle creaking softly in the quiet room. "At first I thought it was just a sensor light," she continued. "But it moved when the sunlight hit the glass." The room remained silent. Outside the office door, a distant elevator chime echoed faintly down the hallway. One of the younger executives leaned forward in his chair, curiosity replacing the earlier skepticism. "You saw it this morning?" he asked. Naomi nodded again. "Yes, sir." Alexander Grant slowly pushed his chair back from the table and stood. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, but it changed the atmosphere instantly. When the most powerful person in a room decides to look closer at something, everyone else begins to wonder what they may have missed. He walked toward the bookshelf behind his desk, each step soft against the polished wood floor. Naomi watched carefully, but said nothing more. She had already said enough. The sunlight had shifted slightly now, angling across the glass shelves and casting thin reflections along the vent above them. Alexander stopped a few feet away and lifted his eyes toward the narrow metal grill. For a moment he saw only shadow. Then something inside the vent caught the light. A faint flicker, so small it could easily be mistaken for dust. Alexander Grant stood motionless for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the narrow vent above the bookshelf. At first it looked exactly the way it always had, a simple strip of gray metal designed to disappear into the wall. Then the sunlight shifted again across the glass shelves, and the reflection changed. Something inside the vent glinted briefly, a pinpoint spark no larger than the head of a pin. Alexander's expression did not change, but his mind was already moving through possibilities. Grant Tower had one of the most advanced security systems in the city. Every corridor, elevator bank, and parking entrance was monitored 24 hours a day. Yet his private office had always been considered the safest place in the building. The executives behind him leaned forward in their chairs, trying to see what he was seeing. The quiet tension in the room deepened as Alexander stepped closer to the wall and reached up toward the vent. The grill sat about 8 feet from the floor, slightly above eye level even for him. He paused for a moment, studying the angle of the reflection. It flickered again, faint but unmistakable. Behind him someone cleared their throat. "Mr. Grant, perhaps it is simply a sensor from the air system," one of the senior advisors said carefully, his voice controlled but uncertain. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward the long conference table. "Daniel," he said calmly. A man in a navy suit seated halfway down the table straightened at once. Daniel Brooks had been head of Grant Dynamics Security Operations for nearly 6 years, a former federal cybersecurity analyst who rarely spoke unless something required attention. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. Alexander gestured toward the vent without taking his eyes off it. "Would you take a look at that?" The request was simple, but it carried the quiet authority that had built an entire company from nothing. Daniel rose from his chair and walked toward the wall, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as he approached. He followed Alexander's gaze upward, narrowing his eyes slightly. For several seconds, he saw nothing unusual. Then the light shifted again. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he murmured. The executives around the table leaned forward further. Naomi Carter remained near the doorway, still holding the cleaning bucket. She watched silently, her eyes moving between Alexander and the security chief. Daniel stepped closer to the wall and examined the narrow slats of the vent more carefully. The tiny reflection inside the grill blinked once, almost like a distant star appearing and disappearing behind clouds. Daniel lifted his hand slowly and ran his fingers along the edge of the metal vent cover. It felt secure, but something inside it was not part of the building's standard ventilation system. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, "may I?" Alexander nodded once. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small folding multi-tool. The quiet click of the tool opening sounded louder than it should have in the still room. Carefully, he loosened the small screws that held the vent cover in place. Each turn of the tool produced a soft metallic tick that echoed faintly off the office walls. Within seconds, the grill came free. Daniel lowered it slowly and looked inside the dark space behind it. His eyes focused on a tiny black device no larger than a quarter, mounted carefully against the interior panel of the vent. A thin wire ran along the metal surface, disappearing deeper into the wall. Daniel did not touch it immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward Alexander Grant. "That is not part of our system," he said evenly. Daniel Brooks kept his hand steady as he held the small vent cover in one hand and stared into the narrow opening in the wall. The device inside the vent was positioned with careful precision, attached to the metal panel with a slim magnetic plate and a strip of industrial tape that matched the color of the ductwork almost perfectly. It was designed not to be noticed. The tiny lens faced outward through one of the slats where the metal had been subtly filed down to widen the viewing angle. A thin cable no thicker than a headphone wire slipped along the inside of the duct and disappeared behind the drywall. Daniel leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the shape and the casing of the device. He had spent years studying surveillance equipment, and recognition came quickly. This was not something purchased at an electronics store. This was custom hardware. Behind him, the room had gone completely silent. The executives who had entered the meeting expecting to discuss numbers and market forecasts now watched a different kind of calculation unfolding. Alexander Grant stood only a few feet away, his posture calm but attentive, his gaze fixed on the small camera inside the wall. Naomi Carter remained by the doorway, still holding the cleaning bucket as if she might need to continue her work at any moment. She had not moved since Daniel opened the vent. She had only watched. Daniel finally straightened and carefully set the vent cover on the edge of Alexander's desk. "It is transmitting," he said quietly. One of the executives spoke up immediately. "Transmitting where?" Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he reached carefully into the vent and touched the small device just long enough to confirm the indicator light blinking faintly along its edge. The light pulsed once every few seconds. "Active. This is a live wireless unit," Daniel said. "High grade. Someone installed it to capture video and audio from inside this room." A faint ripple of unease moved across the conference table. One of the board members leaned forward sharply. "That is impossible. Security checks this office every week." Daniel glanced back at him calmly. "They check for standard threats." He gestured toward the tiny lens. This was designed to avoid standard detection. Alexander Grant walked slowly toward the desk and looked down at the vent cover Daniel had removed. The metal piece looked ordinary enough, but now that it was out of place, the room felt subtly altered, as if a hidden door had been opened. "How long would something like that operate?" Alexander asked. Daniel studied the device again. "With this battery size, it could run for several months. Possibly longer if it is connected to a secondary power line." The statement landed heavily in the quiet office. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. Months meant that whoever placed the device had been observing more than a single meeting. They had been watching strategy sessions, negotiations, confidential calls. Everything. Alexander's expression remained controlled, but the atmosphere around him sharpened slightly, the way it always did when he began to analyze a problem at full attention. He turned his head slowly toward the conference table and scanned the faces in the room one by one. Most looked confused. Some looked concerned. One looked briefly toward the window before returning his eyes to the table. Naomi noticed the shift as well. From the doorway, she could see the subtle change in Alexander's posture, the quiet tightening of focus that made people inside the company say that when he stopped speaking, he had already started solving the problem. Finally, Alexander looked toward Daniel again. "Disable it," he said calmly. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Sir, if I disable it immediately, whoever is receiving the signal will know we found it." Alexander considered that for a moment. The office remained silent except for the faint hum of the air vent above them. Then his gaze moved slowly across the room again, thoughtful now, almost reflective. Then we do not disable it yet, he said. Daniel Brooks slowly placed the vent cover back onto Alexander Grant's desk, while the tiny surveillance device remained inside the wall, its faint indicator light blinking quietly in the narrow duct above the bookshelf. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier now, not simply tense but thoughtful, as if the entire office had shifted into a different kind of meeting. The merger contract still lay open on the long walnut table, its final page waiting for a signature that had almost happened minutes earlier. Alexander Grant turned away from the vent and walked back toward the table with the same measured pace he used in high-level negotiations. His eyes moved briefly across the faces of the executives seated around the room. Some looked unsettled. Others looked curious. One or two had the cautious expression of people already calculating what the discovery might mean for the company's security. Daniel stepped back from the wall and spoke again in a calm, controlled voice. If the device continues transmitting, whoever installed it will assume nothing has changed. Alexander nodded once. Good. He rested one hand lightly against the back of his chair, but did not sit down yet. The afternoon sunlight had shifted slightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching long reflections across the polished surface of the conference table. Naomi Carter remained near the doorway, still holding the plastic bucket as though she had simply paused while finishing her morning routine. She had not expected the room to fall this quiet after she spoke. In fact, she had expected someone to tell her she was mistaken. Instead, the most powerful people in the building were now studying a small hidden camera because she had noticed a flicker of light. One of the executives cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Grant," he said, "should we postpone the signing until security can investigate?" Alexander looked down at the contract for a moment, then lifted his gaze toward Daniel. "How quickly can you trace where that signal is going?" Daniel considered the question. "If we intercept the wireless frequency without alerting the device, we could identify the receiver within a few minutes. Possibly less if it is still transmitting in real time." Alexander finally sat down in his chair again. The leather creased softly beneath him. "Then that is what we will do." Daniel nodded and reached into his jacket pocket again, this time removing a small handheld analyzer roughly the size of a smartphone. He activated the device and watched the small digital display as it began scanning the surrounding frequencies. A soft electronic tone sounded every few seconds as signals appeared and disappeared on the screen. The executives watched with quiet concentration while Daniel adjusted the analyzer's sensitivity. The blinking indicator inside the vent continued its steady rhythm. Naomi shifted her weight slightly near the doorway, careful not to draw attention to herself. She could see Daniel's screen from across the room, a grid of faint green lines moving across the display as the device searched for active transmissions. Then the analyzer paused. A single signal line brightened sharply. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied the data. "Found it," he said quietly. Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Location." Daniel glanced at the reading again, confirming the signal direction and strength. When he spoke, his voice remained calm, but carried a subtle note of surprise. "The receiver is not outside the building." Several heads turned immediately. Daniel lifted his eyes toward Alexander. "It is coming from inside Grant Tower." Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the analyzer screen while the thin green signal line pulsed steadily across the display. The room seemed to lean toward him without anyone physically moving. Alexander Grant rested his elbows lightly on the conference table, his hands folded in front of him, watching the device with quiet focus. The executives around the table exchanged uneasy glances. The idea that the signal was coming from inside Grant Tower changed the situation entirely. This was no longer an external threat or a distant competitor trying to steal corporate strategy. This meant the person receiving the footage was somewhere in the same building, perhaps even on the same floor. Daniel tapped a few controls on the analyzer and narrowed the scanning range. The display responded immediately, isolating the transmission frequency more precisely. The faint electronic tone shifted into a sharper pattern as the device locked onto the signal source. "The transmission strength is very strong," Daniel said calmly, "which means the receiver is close." One of the executives leaned forward with visible concern. "How close?" Daniel studied the directional indicator on the screen. A small arrow rotated slowly until it pointed toward the glass wall that faced the interior hallway of the executive floor. He lifted his head and followed the direction of the signal with his eyes. The hallway outside Alexander's office stretched nearly 30 feet before turning toward the private elevator lobby used by senior leadership. The polished marble floor outside reflected the ceiling lights like a quiet mirror. "Same floor," Daniel said quietly. The words settled into the room like a weight. Alexander's gaze shifted toward the office door, then back to Daniel. "Can you narrow it further?" Daniel nodded and adjusted the analyzer again, reducing the signal field step by step. Each adjustment sharpened the direction reading. The arrow on the screen drifted slightly left, then stabilized. Daniel's expression grew more focused. "It is coming from somewhere along this corridor," he said. One of the board members spoke up carefully. "You are telling us someone inside this floor is watching our meetings?" Daniel did not immediately answer. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the vent above the bookshelf where the tiny camera still blinked faintly in the shadow. Then he returned his attention to the analyzer. "Yes," he said simply. The room fell silent again. Naomi Carter stood near the doorway, watching the scene unfold with quiet alertness. From where she stood, she could see the hallway through the open office door. Nothing moved out there except the soft glow of the ceiling lights reflecting on the marble floor. No footsteps, no voices, just stillness. Alexander Grant slowly rose from his chair again. The movement drew every eye in the room. He walked toward the doorway and stopped just inside the frame, looking out into the corridor. The hallway appeared perfectly ordinary, the same executive floor that employees crossed every day without thinking twice. Offices lined both sides of the corridor, each door closed, each frosted glass panel glowing faintly with interior light. Alexander studied the corridor for several seconds before speaking. "Daniel," he said calmly, "if someone is receiving that signal nearby, would they know we are tracing it?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "Not unless we shut the camera down." Alexander nodded once. His gaze moved slowly along the row of office doors visible from where he stood. Then it stopped. The analyzer in Daniel's hand beeped softly again, the directional arrow shifting just a few degrees before settling into a new position. Daniel looked down at the screen, then lifted his eyes toward the hallway. "Sir," he said quietly, "the signal just moved." Daniel Brooks lowered the analyzer slightly and stared at the screen as the directional arrow shifted again. The soft electronic tone changed pitch, rising half a step before stabilizing. That single sound altered the atmosphere inside Alexander Grant's office more than any words could have. The executives around the conference table leaned forward almost instinctively. Alexander remained standing near the doorway, his gaze fixed on the hallway outside, while Daniel studied the signal reading. "It is moving down the corridor," Daniel said quietly. His voice remained controlled, but the precision in it carried urgency. Alexander turned his head slightly without taking his eyes off the hallway. "Walking." Daniel glanced again at the screen. The arrow rotated slowly, adjusting by a few degrees every second. "Yes, sir." The corridor outside remained silent. The marble floor reflected the overhead lights in long pale strips that stretched toward the elevator lobby at the far end. From where Naomi Carter stood near the office wall, she could see the hallway clearly now. At first there was nothing. Then the faint sound of footsteps reached them. Not hurried. Calm. Confident. A figure appeared from around the corner near the private elevator entrance and began walking toward Alexander's office. The person moved with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged on the executive floor. Naomi's eyes focused carefully. The woman approaching wore a cream-colored blazer and carried a slim tablet in one hand. Her posture was composed, her pace unhurried. Victoria Hale. Several people in the conference room recognized her immediately through the open doorway. Victoria Hale was well known within Grant Dynamics. She was a successful investment strategist, a frequent presence in board-level discussions, and most importantly, she was Alexander Grant's fiancée. Daniel looked down again at the analyzer. The arrow on the screen now pointed directly toward the approaching footsteps. The signal strength climbed sharply, the green line on the display brightening as the distance between transmitter and receiver closed. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly. Alexander had already understood. Victoria stepped into view of the open doorway and paused when she saw the group gathered inside the office. Her expression showed mild curiosity rather than concern. "Alexander," she said with a warm smile, her voice smooth and relaxed. "I thought the signing was scheduled for 3:30. The analyzer in Daniel's hand emitted another clear tone. The signal reading reached its strongest point. Daniel did not need to look at the display again to confirm what it meant. Alexander Grant remained very still for a moment. The late afternoon sunlight behind him framed the doorway with a soft glow, reflecting faintly across the polished floor between them. His gaze rested on Victoria with calm clarity. Naomi watched from the side of the room, her eyes moving between Daniel's analyzer and the woman standing in the hallway. Victoria noticed the unusual silence in the room and glanced briefly toward the conference table where the executives sat watching her carefully. "Did I interrupt something?" she asked lightly. Daniel slowly lowered the analyzer to his side. The signal indicator on the screen still glowed bright green. Alexander's voice when he finally spoke was quiet, steady, and unmistakably focused. "Victoria," he said, "what device are you carrying in that tablet?" Victoria Hale stood in the doorway for a moment, her expression still composed, though the room no longer felt like the friendly environment she had expected. The sunlight from the windows behind the conference table stretched across the floor between her and Alexander Grant, creating a long pale strip of light that seemed to separate the hallway from the quiet tension inside the office. She glanced briefly toward Daniel Brooks, then toward the analyzer still glowing faintly in his hand. "It is just my tablet, Alexander," she said calmly. "I was reviewing the market briefing for the merger." Her tone carried the same polished confidence she used in every boardroom conversation. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched her carefully, his posture relaxed but his attention sharpened. Behind him, the executives remained seated, silent observers now to a moment that none of them had anticipated when the meeting began. Daniel slowly lifted the analyzer again and glanced at the display. The signal strength line remained steady and bright. He spoke without raising his voice. "Sir, the transmission is strongest within 6 feet of the receiver." Victoria's eyes flicked briefly toward the device in Daniel's hand before returning to Alexander. The shift was subtle, but Naomi Carter noticed it immediately from across the room. Naomi had spent years watching people who believed no one was paying attention. She recognized the small changes in posture that happened when someone realized the situation had turned unexpectedly serious. Victoria stepped into the office, the soft sound of her heels crossing the polished floor echoing lightly in the quiet room. "If this is about security again, Alexander, you know my firm has already reviewed the building protocols," she said with an easy smile. "Grant Tower is one of the most protected corporate headquarters in Chicago." Daniel glanced again at the analyzer and then lifted his eyes toward the tablet in Victoria's hand. The arrow on the display had not moved. Alexander noticed the same detail. His gaze shifted from Victoria's face to the slim device she carried. "May I see it?" he said calmly. Victoria paused for half a second before extending the tablet toward him. Alexander accepted it without hurry and turned the screen slightly so Daniel could see it. The display showed a standard financial dashboard, lines of data scrolling across a series of market reports. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Daniel watched the analyzer screen again. The signal remained exactly where it had been. "Sir," he said quietly, "the receiver has not moved." Alexander slowly rotated the tablet in his hands, studying its edges. The device looked identical to thousands of others used in offices across the country. Smooth glass, thin aluminum frame, nothing obvious. Then he noticed the small accessory attached along the back corner of the case. It was no larger than a postage stamp, a slim metallic plate that appeared to be part of the tablet cover. Daniel leaned slightly closer, his attention fixed on the same detail. The analyzer emitted another soft tone. Alexander looked up at Victoria again, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably precise. "Victoria," he said quietly, "why does your tablet case contain a wireless relay transmitter?" For the first time since she entered the room, Victoria Hale did not answer immediately. The question hung quietly in the air between them. Victoria Hale looked at the tablet in Alexander Grant's hands, then back at his face. For the first time since she entered the office, the confidence in her posture shifted slightly. It was not panic. It was calculation. Around the conference table, no one moved. Daniel Brooks kept the analyzer steady in his hand, the small green signal line glowing steadily on the screen. Naomi Carter remained near the doorway, her eyes fixed on the slim metallic plate attached to the tablet case. Victoria let out a small breath and folded her arms loosely, the expression on her face changing from surprise to something more thoughtful. You always did notice details faster than anyone else, Alexander, she said quietly. Her voice no longer carried the smooth warmth it had a moment earlier. Alexander did not respond immediately. He turned the tablet slightly again, examining the small transmitter plate more closely. The device was cleverly integrated into the protective cover, almost invisible unless someone knew what to look for. Daniel stepped closer and glanced at the tablet. That relay is receiving the camera feed and forwarding it to another location, he said calmly. It is designed to move the signal through multiple networks so the origin cannot easily be traced. Victoria looked at Daniel briefly, then back at Alexander. You already understand what that means, she said. Alexander placed the tablet gently on the conference table. His expression remained composed, but the quiet certainty in his voice left no room for misunderstanding. It means someone inside this building has been collecting private strategy discussions from my office for months. Victoria did not deny it. Instead, she glanced once around the room, taking in the executives seated at the table and the quiet tension that had replaced the earlier anticipation of the merger signing. Finally, her eyes rested on Naomi Carter near the doorway. The look lasted only a second, but Naomi felt it clearly. Not anger. Recognition. Victoria nodded slowly. You noticed the reflection? She said. Naomi did not answer. She only watched. Alexander followed Victoria's gaze toward the doorway and then looked back at her. Why? He asked. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Victoria walked a few steps farther into the office, her heels making soft sounds against the polished floor. Because information is the most valuable asset in any negotiation, she replied evenly. You built this company by understanding that better than anyone. One of the executives shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Alexander remained calm. And the engagement? He asked. Victoria's smile returned, though it carried none of the earlier warmth. Partnerships can take many forms. The room fell quiet again. Outside the windows, the late afternoon light had begun to soften, turning the skyline into a pale gold reflection across the glass walls. Alexander Grant stood for a moment without speaking. Then he picked up the tablet once more and handed it to Daniel. Disable the transmitter, he said calmly. Daniel nodded and moved to the side table where his equipment rested. Victoria watched him work, but did not attempt to stop him. Alexander then turned slowly toward the doorway where Naomi still stood holding the small cleaning bucket. For a moment, the powerful executives in the room followed his gaze and saw the girl who had quietly changed the direction of the entire afternoon. Alexander walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. His voice was calm, almost reflective. You saved us from signing that contract today, he said. Naomi shifted the bucket slightly in her hand, unsure what to say. Alexander looked past her toward the long hallway of Grant Tower where the building continued its normal rhythm of business far beyond this room. Then he looked back at Naomi again. Sometimes the most important voice in the room, he said quietly, is the one everyone almost ignored.